Trindade, a small volcanic island located about 700 miles off the coast of Brazil, is well known today as an important nesting spot for the endangered green turtle. But as you'll see in our next story, turtles might not be the only exotic visitors to this desolate island. It's high noon on January 16, 1958. The Brazilian naval training ship Almirante Saldanha is preparing to depart Trindade Island, Brazil. According to author and historian Amy Title, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more esteemed group of men in passage to spot a UFO.
On board the ship are a number of sailors and also scientists who are going out on an international scientific mission. As the crew members gather on deck before leaving, their attention is all diverted to this thing flying nearby in the sky.
The crew immediately summons their esteemed photographer Almiro Baraúna, and he captures a series of images that would become UFO legend. A dark gray aerial object looks to be flying over the distant mountain. Zooming in reveals what appears to be a saucer-shaped object with a ring around its center, almost resembling the planet Saturn. Baraúna claimed the UFO approached the island, flew behind a mountain peak, and then turned back around the way it came. One of the witnesses, Vice Admiral Paulo de Castro Moreira de Silva, said the object was encircled by a greenish glow.
The crew all saw the object glowing before it turned towards Wisht Peak, then it turned sharply northwest and disappeared from view. The entire encounter lasted just 20 seconds.
Immediately, Baraúna's photos became an international sensation. While some were skeptical of the photographs, their authenticity was seemingly bolstered by multiple investigations.
The photographs were studied by the Brazilian Navy's Aerial Reconnaissance Laboratory, as well as the Aerophotogrammetric Lab of Cruzeiro do Sul. They were deemed to be authentic, taken of a real event, backed up by the eyewitness testimony of military experts and personnel. They were even confirmed by the Brazilian president at the time.
In the years since, however, new details revealed about the incident have drawn skepticism to the once bona fide evidence.
Baraúna held the negatives away from the Brazilian Navy for 2 days before surrendering them. He had even cut some of the photographs off of the end of the film roll. It's unclear whether he tampered with the negatives before handing them over or whether there was something else on the film he didn't want seen. And in August of 2010, a Brazilian TV show claimed he was known to have created hoaxed photographs before.
Both in spite of and because of the controversy, the incident continues to be one of Brazil's most famous UFO encounters. And that's saying something.
The Brazilian UFO archive spans 60 years and has more than 700 documented and researched UFO cases. And of all of them, this is one of the most legendary cases in all of Brazil's history.
Brazilian newspapers ended up printing Baraúna's photographs. He took 6 pictures in total, but the alleged saucer only appeared in 4 of them, supposedly because he was bumped by sailors during the excitement of the event. Something tells me our experts are just as hyped up to analyze this case. Visual effects and astronomy expert Mark D'Antonio has seen these photos before. In fact, he credits them for his getting into ufology in the first place.
I grew up with this image. When I was a little kid, this was my gateway UFO.
First, D'Antonio addresses the theory that this is simply a terrestrial aircraft.
Aircraft at the time had very specific shapes, and it doesn't match any of those configurations for 1958.
Astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy reviews another common theory that this object is simply a bird.
It's shaped somewhat similarly to a bird in flight, but birds actually tend to absorb more light. So they would show up as a shadowy object against a relatively bright blue sky. So in this case, I think we can safely rule out it being a bird.
But examining the shadows further alerts McCarthy to a detail he considers suspicious.
When you look at this object closely, you see that the top and bottom of it are roughly the same brightness. If this was a flying object, the top of it would be illuminated by the sun and the bottom would be in shadow. as since this object doesn't seem to obey the laws of physics, I have to start looking at other explanations of how this managed to get on film.
So are these legendary photos a hoax after all? One theory is that airbrushing techniques were used to create a hoax, but McCarthy disagrees.
Airbrushing film is basically like painting whatever you want directly into the film negative, which of course would be easily detectable by the Brazilian Navy. So it may still be a hoax, just not airbrushed.
If there's no smoking gun, how do we decide if it's real or a hoax? D'Antonio says the answer is a little more nuanced than that.
There's no way to look at this and definitively say it's a hoax or definitively say it's real, because there's problems with each of those determinations. But if these are a hoax, you know what I say? So what? Why? Because these are images that many people grew up with, and they learned to be critical thinkers as a result of them. My entry into the field is in part because of this photo. If it's hoaxed, it brought in a lot of people into ufology, and we were better for it.
Our verdict? For now, this remains a genuine UFO. All we really know is that a group of scientists claim to have seen a glowing object in the sky at the same time. We don't think the negatives were airbrushed, but we still can't explain the anomalous light and shadow. This flying object could be real, it could be fake, but until we learn more, it remains unidentified. Now let's transfer from a boat to a train. Our next video recently set the internet on fire when some tourists on this trip became part of a monstrous mystery. October 8th, 2023, Southwest Colorado. A group of railway enthusiasts is enjoying a tranquil voyage on the scenic Durango and Silverton line when several of the passengers spot something they can't quite figure out. One of them takes out a camera and records this. A hulking sandy-colored figure is walking on two legs amongst the brush on a rocky hillside, and then it squats down. Did you miss him? Look again. You can see the subject's brownish coloring almost blend in perfectly with his surroundings. This bipedal creature appears to be massive in height and is taking a stroll in an area that, according to field researcher Cliff Barrickman, is well-known Sasquatch territory.
This particular area north of Durango and south of Silverton has a number of Sasquatch reports. People have reportedly seen Sasquatches off of the train long before this video was taken.
Barrickman suggests that this creature's motion, stopping and sitting in place, may be indicative of typical Bigfoot behavior.
How many times have you been scared of something and just like you totally froze? That's called attentive immobility.
You've heard of fight or flight? Well, attentive immobility is a third response used by animals and humans alike when encountering a dangerous situation. It's an unconscious decision made by the brain, triggered by fear.
Sasquatches have repeatedly shown this same behavior.
This potential Sasquatch isn't the only giant humanoid that's been spotted from America's railways. A mysterious creature dubbed the Metro Monster is said to haunt the dark corners of the Washington, D.C. metro system, scouring the tunnels of DuPont Circle and terrorizing commuters who cross its path. So, should we be fearful of this alleged beast in Colorado? Let's see what our experts think. We brought this uncanny footage to forensic video analyst Michael Primo to make sure it wasn't a fake.
We noted that there is a processing that was done in some way, shape, or form with something called image enlargement or pixel interpolation. So the images have been enlarged to try to gain a more clear depiction of this thing within the scene.
Although this footage was enhanced, Primo doesn't believe anything was done to alter or fabricate the appearance of the creature itself.
We did not note any evidence of tampering that would be consistent with third-party editing applications or CGI in any way. It appears that the subject is within this space and it was captured in real time.
So the video is legit, but could that mean we're looking at an actual Sasquatch? Bigfoot expert and anthropologist Jeff Meldrum admits the camouflage coloring of this specimen is congruous with the many shades of Bigfoot.
This Sasquatch has been reported with a range of colors that span quite a spectrum from almost albino to very, very dark. Even a light tawny color, very similar to what we see here.
However, according to Meldrum, the indicators that this could be a real Sasquatch in there.
It clearly is moving in a very contrived way. It seems odd that it would venture out into the open space in the light of day. It seems unlikely that a predator would reveal itself in such an overt way.
And perhaps the biggest red flag, telltale signs of a costume being used.
The appearance of the fur is more indicative of artificial fiber. The legs are like straight lines. There's no contour to muscle mass or limb segments. And it's clearly one of the more popular costumes available commercially.
So do we have any idea who would try to pull off such a hoax?
As it happens, there's a business in the region, Sasquatch Expedition Campers. And looking at their advertising, they employ a Sasquatch costume.
As you can see, the similarities between that costume and the creature in the video are strong. So, exercising due diligence, we reached out to this local business, where we spoke with employee Cass Kramer.
Well, we got a lot of people thinking it was us, and so we had fun with it. We made a couple little posts, maybe implying it was, maybe it wasn't, but it wasn't us. It'd be cool to find him, but what I like about Sasquatch is, he's out there roaming the countryside by himself, unbounded.
Our verdict? I think we can confidently call this one a hoax. While Cass and his fellow employees have denied any involvement, I think they may be having a little bit of fun pulling our leg. But as always, we'll still be keeping an eye out for the real thing. It's been more than 160 years since the Battle of Gettysburg. Many believe this 3-day Civil War bloodbath left behind some of the most haunted ground in America. And this video may capture the proof. It's the evening of September 2nd, 2020 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. A tourist who has asked not to be named is driving through the historic battlefield with his family. He suddenly starts hearing strange noises, and then history comes to life. A camera shooting through the windshield shows 2 cannons coming up on the right side of the road, when out of nowhere, a couple of human-like silhouettes flash into the frame. One appears and vanishes quickly, but the other stays in view for a whole 3 seconds before disappearing.
For these tourists who came to this area just to get a glimpse of the history, to catch a glimpse of the afterlife, I find to be extraordinary.
There may be a very simple explanation for these ghostly apparitions. Gettysburg was the single bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and these cannons from an unspecified part of the battlefield likely did their share of killing.
This plot of land is the bullseye. This is where it's happening, and I think this is what we were seeing in this footage right by those cannons. Ghostly apparitions.
Nearly a third of the soldiers who fought in Gettysburg were either wounded, killed, or reported missing after the battle. Brooks says eerie energy permeates the entire town to this day, and there have been regular alleged sightings of Civil War ghosts.
The Balladary Inn served as a Union field hospital. It has captured many, many images of ghostly remnants and apparitions around the area. Then there's the Daniel Lady Farm. Now this served as the Confederate field hospital. There are many accounts of ghostly apparitions that have shown up there.
So could these photos and our video show the souls of Civil War soldiers waiting in purgatory? Catholic miracle researcher Michael O'Neill says this Christian concept is like God's waiting room.
According to Catholic belief, those people whose souls aren't ready to meet God go through some time of purgation in which they're perfected and made ready to be in the beatific vision with God. There is no set time for purgatory. Some might make the argument that returning to the place of one's death is similar to the idea of working through purgatory on their way to heaven.
There are reports of haunted battlefields worldwide. In Japan, people still pray in a cave said to be haunted by villagers who were instructed by the Army to die by mass suicide during the Battle of Okinawa in World War II. Yet, what's the story with the moving blurs back in Gettysburg? Let's let our expert shine a light on this one. First, physicist Dr. Matthew Shadagas examines if these wisps could be mini dust devils, swirling columns of dirt that, unlike tornadoes, form on clear weather days.
This appears to be a fairly grassy area, so I don't see any evidence that there's loose dirt or dust, and I don't see any evidence of wind elsewhere in the video.
Then what about the ghost theory? Forensic video analyst Michael Primo understands why some people see what looks like human apparitions.
As the video plays, you can sort of see this faint line that's running vertically here. And even at a certain point, it almost looks like you could identify a head and some sort of torso.
So Primo goes back in to take a closer look.
Adding a filter called Sobel in our enhancement tool, we can better see the lines within an image and thus shows the dark toned circular object more clearly. It appears that this was something that was recorded in front of the camera, and we can explain it as something on the windshield.
Primo concludes it's the perfect timing and positioning of what's likely a dead bug, a water droplet, or a bit of sap that brings this spooky scene to life.
The three components that contribute to the false interpretation of these images are the size of the objects, the timing as it travels past these cannons, as well as the direction, moving from the right to the left. They all kind of paint this picture that this ghost is running from this area where they had once lived into the roadway, and that's simply not the case.
Our verdict? Conveniently placed window smudges. With that said, we still have no explanation for those mysterious noises the family heard at the start of this incident. So maybe there is more to this than meets the eye and the ear. Iceland is home to many natural wonders, including, apparently, a humongous worm monster with a 16-letter name. Does this next video prove the existence of Largo Flotsamer? Is that close? No? February 2nd, 2012, Eilstadur, Iceland. Hjörtur Kurloff, a sheep farmer, is having his morning coffee when from the window of his kitchen he sees something strange. He grabs his camera and records this. It appears to be a large, worm-like creature swimming in the fresh waters of Lagerflot Lake. It's black in color, dusted with ice, and is long enough to have several humps in its body. As we push in on the video, you can see it undulating through the cold winter waters.
What's really significant about this case is that we actually have evidence that this thing has been there for centuries. In 1585, a cartographer by the name of Abraham Othelius actually notated on his map that the locals believed that there was a giant, menacing snake-like animal that lived in this particular lake. But there are a number of modern eyewitness sightings that are pretty notable. In 1983, some telephone workers that were maintaining some underwater telephone cables encountered some kind of strange creature and also learned that the underwater cables had actually been damaged by something. And then as recently as 1998, a teacher and student claimed that they saw this creature from a schoolhouse that was situated on the shore.
The rivers and lake around Eilstadur are made from melting glaciers, making the waters very deep, very dark, and very cold.
The Lagerflotmuren is described as being anywhere from 20 to 30 feet long, dark gray in color, with a horse-like head and a tail very similar to a whale's. And it's described as undulating through the water in either a vertical or horizontal fashion, which is exactly what we're seeing in this particular film. A scientific commission in Iceland actually declared this footage as being genuine or authentic in 2014.
The municipality of Iglustadir offered a reward of 500,000 Icelandic kronas, or about $3,600 to anyone who can find evidence that proves that the worm-like monster is real. Will Hjortur be able to collect his reward? We turn to our experts to find out. While many speculators have suggested that this could be a giant snake of some kind, biologist Stephanie Manka is doubtful.
The biggest reason why this is not a snake is because this is an icy lake. Snakes don't live in water as cold as this. They can't live in icy conditions. In areas where there is snow and ice, they hibernate in the winter and they slow down their metabolism so that they can survive.
To find out if this could be the famed logger floatsomer, we turn to marine biologist Dr. Shay Steingass.
An animal of this size would need an immense amount of calories to survive and thrive in these waters. Living in water is a lot more energetically demanding because water sucks heat away from you a lot quicker than in air. And the fact that there would be some kind of a large-bodied worm living in these icy waters is not a real biological possibility.
If it isn't a snake or the famous Icelandic worm, what type of animal is it?
When you look at the frame of reference of what appears to be the head of this creature, you can tell it's actually not moving forward at all. It looks like it's fixed in place. And for that reason, I don't think this is a living animal.
Given Iceland's frigid February temperatures, some theorize it could be ice we're seeing.
I don't think it's likely that this is just ice on its own, because if this were just ice, it would probably break up and just float away. What we're seeing here are likely water particles bouncing off of this flexible and dynamic object, and it is creating a wave-like pattern in it because of the wave energy itself. I think this is probably some kind of a long rope that has been in the water for a long time and has accumulated ice and is being buffeted by the action of the water around it. And because that ice is broken up a little bit, it's able to have a lot of movement.
Our verdict? We're calling this an unknown object. And let me explain why. Our experts are pretty sure it's a frozen rope that's stuck on something and collecting ice. Fine. But in August 2014, an Icelandic Truth Commission voted to authenticate the video as genuine, and Hjortur collected the reward. So that leaves us unsure about either conclusion. One thing is certain, though. I deserve a round of applause for pronouncing all of those Icelandic names. We have respect for the world's great religions on this show. So we want to tread carefully with this next piece. It's about Christianity and some ideas that are truly out of this world. May 2023, about 12 miles northwest of the capital of Tbilisi, Georgia, the majestic Svetitskhoveli Cathedral sits on a hill. Inside is a painting that's hundreds of years old, but just now taking the internet by storm. It's a depiction of Jesus' crucifixion with what looks like two flying saucers in the background. One blue, one red, their classic domed shapes have three sharp triangles sprouting from their undersides. It's an image that appears so unusual, it caught the attention of Brett Nicholson, lead pastor of One Life Church in Kentucky.
My first reaction was, wow, those look like flying saucers. Typically with scenes of the crucifixion, you'll see Jesus between two thieves. You'll see the people at the base of the cross. What you don't see in most portrayals of the crucifixion is UFOs.
That may be true, but according to author Jason Martell, people have been exploring the connection between Christianity and UFOs for centuries.
In 1584, a Christian monk named Giordano Bruno from Naples theorized that there were an infinite number of planets, all with intelligent life, each one having its own Jesus Christ visiting that planet. In more recent times, my colleague and good friend Eric von Daniken has theorized that many of these depictions of some type of a religious event are actually depicting some type of an extraterrestrial interaction, possibly aliens visiting ancient man.
We know that ancient pagan religions often explain things by saying the gods were responsible. For instance, ancient Greeks believed the goddess Demeter was responsible for the changing seasons. Could the authors of the Bible have done the same thing? If ancient astronauts visited Earth, did previous civilizations chalk this up to visitations by angels or communication from God? Was Jesus himself an extraterrestrial visitor?
Some people have pointed out the fact Jesus Christ today could be classified as some type of higher intelligence, possibly even extraterrestrial. This would explain some of the miraculous abilities that he was able to perform.
Pope Francis commented that if Martians were to land on Earth and wanted to be baptized, he would welcome them with open arms. It seems the lines between religion and ufology have never been blurrier. Perhaps this painting can finally prove a distinct connection. First, Catholic scholar and miracle hunter Michael O'Neill says the scripture makes clear that Jesus was no extraterrestrial.
When we see Jesus walking the earth in the Bible, he does so as a human. We also know Jesus, of course, is born on earth. Mary of Nazareth is his biological mother. So therefore, Jesus is not an alien.
So if you read the Bible literally, Jesus himself was human. But could other biblical figures have had close encounters with aliens that they interpreted as messages from God? Based on modern-day alien abduction reports, O'Neill doesn't see the connection.
Some people who claim alien abductions say they've gone through surgical experimentation or procedures. They've had loss of memory or loss of time during that period. This is not similar in any way to what we see in the Bible. Because these are such drastically different experiences, there's no reason at all to think they share a common source.
So if ufology and Christianity truly don't intersect in any way, how do we explain what looks like flying saucers in the painting in Georgia? According to archaeologist Ed Barnhart, looks can be deceiving.
The principles of art history say we look to similar examples to try to understand what these symbols are. There are hundreds of these paintings of Jesus at crucifixion, and each one of them have things floating above his face on the left and right. But instead of these two alien spaceships, they show angels.
But Barnhart believes that, as this painting is in an Eastern Orthodox church, instead of angels, the artist chose another symbol.
We know that the Eastern Orthodox Church focuses on the statement that just as he was crucified, the sky went dark. So in standard depictions in Eastern Orthodox crucifixion, we oftentimes see the sun and the moon half covered. It's denoting that eclipse moment. So these are really very similar to other standard depictions of the same time in which we see a half moon and a half sun.
Let there be light. Our verdict? These are just depictions of the sun and the moon. But scholars estimate there are about 4,000 different religions practiced throughout the world. So who's to say? Maybe one of them has been inspired by extraterrestrial interaction. We've read about it in books and we've seen it on stage and screen. But how does it happen? We're talking about levitation. You'll get a rise out of this next video. It's August 2018. Somewhere in Africa, a crowd has gathered for what looks to be a ritual or celebration of sorts. Someone pulls out a camera phone to record the scene. Drums are pounding, and there's high-pitched singing as onlookers watch someone, apparently hovering several feet above them, floating and flipping in the air. Could this be part of some kind of ritual?
One of the constants I think that you will find in shamanic ritual is their sort of mediating role between the here and the hereafter, the physical and the spiritual. And levitation is considered to be sort of this bridge of the spirit world.
Yale history and religious studies professor Carlos Ayer says that in Catholicism, levitation can be seen as a form of mystical ecstasy.
one saint in particular. St. Joseph Cupertino rose to the ceiling of the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, which is about the same size as your usual European cathedral. He flew, literally, forwards and backwards.
Brooks says an Indian man named Shirdi Sai Baba was also famous for levitating during religious rituals, though it was never caught on film since he died in 1918.
Sai Baba's acts were so astounding and consistent that actually a revered Indian scientist who also witnessed some of these acts found it very difficult to deny that these things were happening.
Something to bear in mind here. All of these historic reports of levitation note a stillness of the person being levitated. The man in this video is far from that. So how does he do it? Let's ask our experts to bring this levitation story down to earth. Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku says that there are ways for humans to become airborne using external forces, such as the concentrated wind tunnels you'd find at an indoor skydiving park.
Air is blown from the floor upwards, and you float on a cushion of air. So airflow levitation is possible, but it's not practical. It would have irregularities, you would have eddy currents. If you are floating that high off the ground, there would be air everywhere in all directions. Leaves would fly around, people's clothing would be fluttering, people's hair would be up.
Yet Kaku says true levitation does exist via magnetic levitation.
A North Pole and a South Pole attract each other, but two North Poles repel each other. So in a maglev train, the railroad has a North Pole, and the train has a North Pole, and they sit on top of each other, and therefore you levitate. But you're only a fraction of an inch off the rail, and it takes an enormous amount of magnetism just to lift you a little bit off the surface of the rail.
So though it's not likely this man is being raised up by magnets, science writer Mick West says there are less authentic forms of levitation.
There are simple versions of levitation where you basically have a pretend foot and you stick two shoes together in front of you.
A magician demonstrates how, after covering himself with a blanket to set up this trick, he takes his right foot out of the attached shoes. He then steps back on that right foot while lifting the left foot with the two shoes, making it appear as if he's floating.
There are other levitation devices like the contoured levitation device, which is used by street magicians. This is basically a very strong steel frame that's they use to have the illusion of balancing on something like a cane.
This isn't something that we see here. So how do we explain this elevated feat? Our experts believe this levitator has some help from a different type of device.
Look carefully, and you can see that when he rotates around a certain axis. And that allows you to determine whether or not he's suspended straight up or whether he's suspended from the side.
We see him kind of like put his leg over it, like he's clambering over a rope, and then he's kind of hanging from it by his hands. And you see here he's bouncing up and down, which is exactly what you would expect if there's a rope that's suspended from somewhere over here to perhaps this tree over here.
And West is able to put this levitation aid to the test.
Here's a rope, and here's something on the rope, and it's bouncing up and down. Now, if you take this video and you kind of run it through the type of compression that is typical for someone sending a cell phone video, you get a much lower quality version. You can still see what's there, what's in the scene, but the rope itself has vanished. So I think that's what's happening here in the video. We just can't see it because of the quality of the video.
Our verdict? Well, let's just take the suspense out of this one. As Mick West suggested, this is a traditional rope dance from Zambia's eastern province. It might raise people's spirits, but not their bodies. On an earlier episode, we featured a video from a viewer who says he successfully used the techniques of a movement known as CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, the kind initiated by the experiencer. In other words, he believes he summoned a UFO he caught on camera. We couldn't determine what it was the first time, but he was adamant we try again. So here goes. It all started on a crisp night in October 2021. Bruce Waterbury was out in his backyard in Meriden, Connecticut, following CE5 protocols to summon a UFO. After meditating on the aliens, he grabs his night vision binoculars, laser pointer, and two-way radio, waiting for contact. After several minutes, something odd appeared in his viewer. A large, bright orb, a classic UFO shape. Excited that he may have summoned an actual UFO using CE5 techniques, Bruce immediately began tracing the object with his laser pointer. It moves from left to right on his screen.
Once I circled it, it kept moving, but then it got super small and then kind of moved out and up back into space.
On our previous episode of Proof, astronomer Mark D'Antonio and Rich Hoffman of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies explored 4 different possibilities of what Bruce's object could and couldn't be. They eliminated planes, drones, and UFOs due to the object's lighting and movement. Their best guess was something called Earth lights, luminous, bright spheres seen floating over different landscapes around the world.
The Earth light phenomena is the closest match that I can come up with.
But even Hoffman admitted that was just a guess, and he couldn't say for sure. Bruce says that since that episode aired, he has seen the same object over his house more than once. And now, more than ever, he wants a definitive answer.
The mystery of what this object is has deepened because no one seems to tell me what exactly it is. Tell me what it is and show me what it is, then I'll be satisfied.
The CE5 movement was begun by Dr. Stephen Greer, who founded the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. According to Greer's protocols, meditation is the key to summoning aliens, which is exactly what Bruce said he did. But can a more definitive conclusion about his footage be reached? According to our own physicist, Matthew Shadagas, the answer is a resounding yes. When Shadagas saw the episode, he immediately knew he could help.
I started jumping up and down and yelling at the TV, and I told my wife, I know exactly what this is.
It reminded Shadagas of something he saw in July 2021 during a UFO hunting expedition to Catalina Island, an island just off the California coast that's considered a UFO hotspot. The research group UAPX saw an object that looked like the one Bruce saw in Connecticut.
Even the scientists on the UAPX team weren't able to make the same identification initially when something like this happened to them.
But Shadagas investigated and realized what the team saw over Catalina was the International Space Station. And in Bruce's case, he has a similar hunch.
The ISS was over Connecticut in October on at least 3 nights at 8:30, 8:50, and 10:20 p.m. So I believe this is evidence that the object in the video is the ISS.
The icing on the cake? Shadagas points to other videos of the ISS captured with night vision, such as this video from 2023 that looks exactly the same. As for why so many people mistake the ISS for a UFO?
The ISS has all of these properties of being a shape that doesn't match almost anything else and a size that's bigger than stars or satellites. All of these properties create a perfect storm of mistaken identity.
The night the train camera captured the figure that would later be labeled Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus A. The title itself already felt like a provocation, a collage of faith, folklore, and digital paranoia, and in my retelling the story does not begin with the footage but with the hum of fluorescent lights in a quiet control room where belief is manufactured frame by frame, where the proof is out there is less a television program than a modern ritual, an altar built of monitors and timelines, and the producers sit like careful priests deciding what doubt is allowed to survive. I imagine the host leaning forward, voice calm, eyes trained on the lens, inviting the audience into a promise that feels scientific but behaves like myth, because the episode in question stitches together 3 strands that should never meet: a shadowy shape pacing a freight train in the Pacific Northwest, a grainy image of a face on a piece of toast that someone insists is Jesus, and a chorus of experts who swear they will separate fact from fantasy. In my fictionalized expansion, the train footage is shot by a maintenance worker named Aaron Cole, a man whose life is ruled by schedules and steel, who believes in torque wrenches and weather reports, not in monsters. And when his phone vibrates in his pocket that night, he almost ignores it because the cold has numbed his fingers and the engine noise is a constant roar, yet instinct tells him to leave the device and record. And what he sees running alongside the train is too tall, too fluid, too wrong to be a bear, its gait unnervingly human, its arms swinging with a rhythm that matches the pistons of the locomotive, a choreography that feels intentional, as if the thing knows it is being watched. The footage is short, shaky, and blurred, which in the language of the proof is out there is already a form of evidence, because clarity would be suspicious, and the producers know that ambiguity is the true engine of belief, so they slow the clip, stabilize it, add contrast, circle the silhouette in red, and suddenly the shadow has a name, and once named it can be argued over endlessly. In my narrative, Aaron does not want fame, but the show wants him, because he represents the reluctant witness, the blue-collar everyman whose sincerity is meant to anchor the spectacle, and when he sits under studio lights recounting the moment, his voice cracks not from fear but from confusion, because what haunts him is not the possibility of Bigfoot but the realization that his understanding of the world might be incomplete. Parallel to this, the episode introduces the image of Jesus on toast, which in lesser hands would be comic relief, but here it is framed with solemnity, as if faith itself is another kind of evidence that can be pixel-peeped and debated, and I imagine the woman who found the toast, Maria Alvarez, a widow who wakes before dawn every day to pray in a kitchen that smells of coffee and bread, and when she sees the face she feels comforted rather than amazed, because to her it is not proof but presence, and the show's cameras intrude gently, promising respect while quietly turning devotion into content. The brilliance and danger of the proof is out there lies in this balancing act, presenting itself as skeptical while feeding on wonder, and in my novelistic retelling I allow the experts to become characters with their own doubts, a wildlife biologist who measures stride length and insists the figure's proportions suggest a human in a costume, a digital analyst who explains pareidolia and shows how the brain seeks faces in chaos, and a theologian who argues that faith does not require verification, yet each of them is framed in a way that leaves room for uncertainty, because certainty would end the episode too quickly. The train footage is replayed again and again, the sound design emphasizing the thud of footsteps that may or may not be there, and in my imagined control room the producers argue about whether to include a moment where the shadow appears to turn its head toward the camera, a fraction of a second that could be motion blur or could be intent, and they include it because it gives the audience a chill, that pleasurable fear that keeps ratings high. I weave into the story the cultural weight of Bigfoot as an American myth, born from forests that once seemed endless and now feel threatened, a creature that embodies the anxiety of wilderness disappearing, and the show exploits this subconsciously, placing the sighting near a train, a symbol of industrial progress cutting through nature, as if Bigfoot is literally racing against modernity. At the same time, the Jesus Toast segment taps into a different hunger, the need for science in a world overwhelmed by data, and by juxtaposing these stories the episode suggests that whether we seek monsters or miracles, we are driven by the same desire to believe that something larger than ourselves is paying attention. In my fictional expansion, viewers flood online forums with frame analyses and prayers, skeptics and believers colliding in comment sections that the producers quietly monitor, harvesting language and reactions for future episodes. Because the proof is out there is iterative, evolving with its audience, feeding back their obsessions to them. Aaron returns home after filming, expecting relief, but instead he finds himself listening to the woods differently, every rustle charged with meaning, and Maria feels a strange emptiness once the cameras leave, as if the private nature of her faith has been diluted by exposure. The episode ends, as all episodes do, with a carefully worded conclusion that claims no definitive answer, only possibilities, and in that refusal lies its power, because the proof is never quite out there, it is always just beyond reach, inviting another clip, another testimony, another night where someone lifts a phone toward the dark. As a novelist, I linger in that unresolved space, exploring how television shapes belief by mimicking investigation while delivering mystery, and how the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a episode becomes less about the truth of what was seen and more about the act of seeing itself, about the way modern eyes are trained to search for meaning in pixels and shadows, and how even skepticism can become a form of faith when packaged with enough authority and atmosphere. By the time the credits roll in my imagined version, the audience has not learned whether Bigfoot ran beside a train or whether Jesus appeared on toast, but they have been invited into a shared dream, one where doubt is not an obstacle but a feature, and that, perhaps, is the most honest proof the show ever offers. In Part 2, the story widens beyond the studio and into the aftershocks that ripple outward once an episode of The Proof is out there airs, because proof in this universe is never static, it mutates as soon as it meets an audience, and the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a segment becomes a catalyst rather than a conclusion, igniting private reckonings and public arguments that the producers both anticipate and quietly manipulate. In my narrative, the morning after broadcast, Aaron Cole wakes before his alarm, his body still calibrated to the rhythms of real work, yet something has shifted, because his phone is already buzzing with messages from strangers who speak to him as if they know him, some thanking him for his bravery, others accusing him of staging a hoax, and a few asking questions that feel disturbingly intimate, about his childhood, his fears, whether he believes in God, as if witnessing a possible monster has granted them permission to interrogate his soul. He scrolls through clips reposted online, slowed down further, sharpened until the image fractures into digital noise, and in some versions the figure looks massive and unmistakably non-human, while in others it collapses into a trick of light, and Aaron realizes that his original experience has been overwritten by interpretations he did not consent to, his memory bending to accommodate the louder voices. At the same time, Maria Alvarez attends morning mass and feels eyes on her, not hostile but curious, parishioners whispering about the woman from television, and when the priest speaks about faith without signs, about belief that does not demand spectacle, she wonders if her quiet devotion has been transformed into a public test, her toast no longer a comfort but an exhibit. The episode's experts, too, are drawn back into the orbit of the story, because the proof is out there thrives on recursive doubt, and the wildlife biologist, Dr. Henry Wallace in my telling, is invited onto a podcast where he is pushed to defend his skepticism against amateur analysts who quote strike measurements and folklore with equal confidence, and though he remains calm, he feels an unfamiliar irritation, a sense that his authority has been diluted by the democratization of analysis, where everyone with software feels entitled to expertise. This tension becomes a theme in Part 2, the erosion of traditional gatekeepers of truth, replaced by a swarm intelligence that amplifies emotion over methodology, and the producers understand this instinctively, scheduling follow-up segments and social media teasers that stoke controversy without resolving it. I imagine a late-night production meeting where they debate whether to release unseen frames from the train footage, frames that show nothing definitive but enough ambiguity to reignite discussion, and they decide to leak them selectively, feeding the algorithmic hunger that keeps the show relevant. As the narrative unfolds, I introduce a new character, Lila Chen, a data analyst who tracks audience engagement for the network, and through her perspective we see belief quantified, charts mapping spikes in interest whenever the word Bigfoot trends alongside religious imagery, revealing an uncomfortable truth that mystery performs best when it straddles the line between science and spirituality. Lila is not cynical by nature, but she becomes uneasy as she realizes her work directly influences which stories are elevated, which doubts are encouraged, and which explanations are sidelined, because the numbers show that certainty, whether affirming or debunking, leads to disengagement, while unresolved questions keep viewers watching. Meanwhile, Aaron's personal life begins to strain under the weight of attention, his co-workers teasing him about outrunning Sasquatch, his supervisor hinting that too much publicity could be a distraction, and his nights haunted by dreams where the train never ends and the figure keeps pace effortlessly, always just beyond reach, and he wakes unsure whether the dream frightens him because of what it suggests. about monsters or because it mirrors his own inability to escape the narrative others have imposed on him. Maria, on the other hand, is approached by a small religious group that wants to display the toes as a traveling relic, and she refuses, feeling instinctively that such exposure would cheapen what was sacred to her, yet her refusal is framed online as evidence of deception, the logic being that only a fraud would hide proof, and she grapples with the paradox of faith in a media age where visibility is equated with truth. The episode's juxtaposition of Bigfoot and Jesus continues to resonate thematically, and in part 2 I lean into this contrast, exploring how both figures occupy liminal spaces, one a creature of the forest mythologized by modern anxiety, the other a religious icon whose image has been reproduced and commodified endlessly, and how the proof is out there treats them with similar analytical tools, freeze frames and expert commentary, flattening profound differences in meaning for the sake of format. I imagine a classroom where a media studies professor uses the episode as an example of contemporary mythmaking, explaining to students how the show's language of investigation masks its narrative strategies, and one student challenges this, arguing that the show provides a platform for genuine inquiry, sparking a debate that mirrors the larger cultural divide between those who see such programs as manipulative and those who see them as democratizing. As part 2 progresses, the producers plan a follow-up visit to the train site, framing it as due diligence, and Aaron is asked to return, a request that fills him with dread and curiosity in equal measure, because part of him wants closure, while another part fears that returning will further entangle him in a story he cannot control. The location itself becomes a character, the tracks cutting through dense forest, the air heavy with damp earth and history, and when the crew arrives, nothing extraordinary happens, which paradoxically heightens tension, because absence can be as provocative as presence, and the cameras linger on empty space, inviting viewers to project meaning onto silence. In the editing room, this footage is treated with reverence, slow pans and ominous music transforming mundanity into potential, and Lila notes how even scenes devoid of anomalies generate engagement when framed correctly, reinforcing her discomfort with the ethics of her work. By the end of part 2, the story has shifted from the initial sighting to the machinery that sustains belief, revealing how individuals like Aaron and Maria are swept into currents larger than themselves, currents driven by attention, algorithmic incentives, and a collective yearning for something beyond the ordinary, and yet I resist offering judgment, because the proof is out there is not a villain but a mirror, reflecting a culture that oscillates between skepticism and wonder, craving both debunking and enchantment. The part closes with Aaron standing by the tracks at dusk, the forest quiet, his phone in his pocket, resisting the urge to record the emptiness, and Maria lighting a candle in her kitchen, the toaster unplugged, both of them caught between private experience and public narrative, while somewhere in a control room producers review footage, debating how to keep the question alive, because as long as doubt persists, the story continues. Part 3 descends deeper into the psychological terrain shaped by the proof is out there, where the question is no longer what was seen but how seeing changes those who look too closely, and the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus' narrative begins to fracture into parallel realities, each sustained by conviction rather than evidence. In this section of the novelistic retelling, I slow time deliberately, stretching moments to examine how belief settles into the body like muscle memory, how doubt becomes habitual, and how the show's language of investigation subtly rewires perception. Aaron Cole returns to his routine on the rails, yet the tracks no longer feel neutral to him, because every mile marker now carries a residue of possibility, and the forest that once represented predictable variables of weather and terrain has become charged with narrative potential, as if the land itself has learned it is being watched. He finds himself replaying the night of the sighting not as a continuous memory but as fragments, edited by repetition, the figures stride elongated in his mind, his silhouette more defined than it ever was in reality, and he struggles to remember what he actually saw versus what he has been told he saw, a confusion that unsettles him more than the idea of Bigfoot ever could. Meanwhile, the producers of The Proof Is Out There commission an internal research memo on viewer psychology, and through Lila Chan's eyes we witness how focus groups describe their reactions using emotional language rather than analytical terms, words like thrill, comfort, and unease recurring more often than likely or unlikely, revealing that the show functions less as an inquiry and more as a managed emotional experience. Lila begins to recognize patterns that disturb her, particularly how viewers who identify strongly with one segment, such as the Jesus toast, are more receptive to the Bigfoot narrative afterward, suggesting that once the door to belief is opened, it rarely closes selectively, and she wonders whether the show is cultivating a generalized openness to extraordinary claims rather than encouraging discernment. Maria Alvarez, for her part, retreats from public life, declining interview requests and avoiding social media, yet isolation brings its own trials, because silence is interpreted as evasion, and she becomes a symbol onto which others project their anxieties about faith being mocked or exploited. In my narrative, Maria's private prayers shift in tone, moving from gratitude to questioning, not of God but of herself, as she wonders whether her moment of comfort has been repurposed into a spectacle she never intended, and this self-doubt gnaws at her with a quiet persistence that mirrors the show's unresolved conclusions. Part 3 also introduces the figure of Julian Marks, an independent online investigator whose channel gained traction by dissecting the train footage frame by frame, presenting himself as a corrective to mainstream media, and Julian's analysis is meticulous yet driven by an almost devotional intensity, as if uncovering the truth will validate his own sense of purpose, and he becomes emblematic of a new class of authority figures who operate outside traditional institutions while wielding significant influence. Julian's audience treats his conclusions with reverence, even when they shift, demonstrating that conviction often matters more than consistency, and his evolving stance on whether the figure is Bigfoot or an elaborate hoax mirrors the audience's appetite for ongoing mystery rather than resolution. The show's producers quietly monitor Julian's content, recognizing both a competitor and a resource, and they debate inviting him onto the program, aware that doing so would legitimize his platform while absorbing his audience, a calculated risk that underscores how the proof is out there feeds on external narratives to sustain itself. Aaron stumbles upon Julian's videos late one night and watches a stranger narrate his experience with confidence that borders on ownership, and he feels a surge of anger mixed with relief, because someone else is now carrying the burden of interpretation, yet this outsourcing of meaning leaves him hollow, as if his role has been reduced to raw footage in someone else's story. In parallel, Dr. Henry Wallace faces professional consequences for his involvement in the episode, colleagues questioning his decision to participate in a show they view as sensationalist, and he defends himself by arguing that engaging with popular media is a way to educate, yet privately he worries that his explanations were edited to preserve ambiguity rather than clarity, compromising his intent. This tension highlights a central theme of Part 3, the collision between expertise and entertainment, and how the latter often subsumes the former, reshaping it into digestible soundbites that reinforce uncertainty rather than dispel it. The forest itself becomes more prominent in this section, described with an almost sentient presence, the camera lingering on moss-covered trunks and shadowed undergrowth, and I use this imagery to explore how environments become mythic through repetition, how a location associated with a single unexplained event can be transformed into a symbol of the unknown, drawing seekers and skeptics alike. The producers schedule a night shoot at the site, complete with infrared cameras and hushed commentary, and although nothing anomalous occurs, the act of watching in darkness becomes performative, the crew whispering as if silence itself might summon evidence, and the footage later edited to suggest proximity to revelation. Lila watches the rough cut and feels a flicker of complicity, recognizing how easily atmosphere can be mistaken for insight, and she begins keeping a private journal, recording her discomfort as a way of resisting total absorption into the machine. Maria experiences a different kind of escalation when a local news crew appears unannounced at her home, seeking a reaction to online theories accusing her of fabricating the toast image, and her refusal to engage is framed as evasive, reinforcing her sense that in the economy of attention, participation is mandatory, and withdrawal is interpreted as guilt. The juxtaposition of Bigfoot and Jesus continues to reverberate, and in part 3 I draw a deliberate parallel between pilgrimage and fandom, between religious relics and viral clips, suggesting that both satisfy a longing for connection to something transcendent, whether framed as spiritual or cryptozoological. Julian Marks announces a live-streamed analysis event, promising a breakthrough, and thousands tune in, their anticipation palpable in scrolling comments, and when his conclusion remains tentative, hedged with caveats, the audience reacts not with disappointment but with renewed enthusiasm, because the absence of closure validates their ongoing engagement. Aaron, watching anonymously, feels a strange kinship with these strangers, united by a shared uncertainty, yet he also feels erased, his lived experience flattened into content, and this alienation pushes him toward a decision he has been avoiding, whether to speak publicly again to reclaim his narrative or to retreat permanently into obscurity. Dr. Wallace delivers a lecture on cognitive biases to his students, using the episode as a case study, and he observes their reactions with concern, noting how some embrace the ambiguity as exciting while others express frustration, revealing generational differences in tolerance for uncertainty shaped by media consumption. As Part 3 draws toward its end, the producers finalize plans for a mid-season special revisiting the Bigfoot train sighting, aware that enough time has passed for nostalgia and speculation to ferment, and they consider introducing a new angle, perhaps a psychological profile of witnesses, subtly shifting the focus from external phenomena to internal experience. Lila reads the proposal and recognizes a potential turning point, an opportunity to interrogate the show's own methods, yet she doubts whether such reflexivity would survive the editing process. The part closes on a quiet note, Aaron standing alone on a platform as a train passes, its lights blurring into streaks, and for a moment he imagines the figure running alongside again, not as a threat but as a mirror, reflecting his own restless search for meaning, while Maria folds her hands in prayer, not asking for signs but for peace, and somewhere, in a dimly lit control room, the monitors glow with pause frames, proof suspended in time, waiting to be interpreted once more, because in the world of the proof is out there, the story is never what happened, but what continues to happen inside those who cannot stop looking. Part 4 shifts the center of gravity from observation to participation, exploring what happens when the audience of the proof is out there is no longer content to watch uncertainty unfold but begins to insert itself directly into the narrative, transforming passive curiosity into active intervention, and in doing so blurring the line between investigation and obsession. In this section, the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus, a storyline metastasizes into a living ecosystem of belief, speculation, and performative skepticism, sustained by the feedback loop between broadcast media and digital communities. Aaron Cole, after weeks of silence, is persuaded by a former co-worker to attend a small gathering of Bigfoot enthusiasts held in a rented lodge not far from the train tracks, not as a speaker but as an observer, a chance, he is told, to see how others interpret his experience without the mediation of producers or editors. He arrives wary and anonymous, blending into a crowd of people whose diversity surprises him, engineers and retirees, young couples and solitary figures, united not by certainty but by fascination, and as he listens to their conversations he realizes that many of them speak about the sighting with a level of emotional investment that eclipses his own, weaving his footage into personal narratives about loss, wonder, and the desire for a world that still contains mysteries untouched by bureaucracy and surveillance. One man describes Bigfoot as a guardian of forgotten spaces, another as a misidentified remnant of human evolution, and Aaron feels a strange vertigo as he recognizes how easily his brief encounter has been absorbed into mythic frameworks that predate him, frameworks that do not require his input to persist. Meanwhile, the producers of The Proof is Out There prepare the mid-season special with meticulous care, aware that the audience's expectations have evolved, and they decide to frame the episode around the concept of convergence, bringing together witnesses, experts, and independent investigators like Julian Marks, whose online following has grown too large to ignore. Julian, invited to participate, sees the offer as validation, yet he approaches it with suspicion, negotiating terms to retain editorial independence, unaware that the show's power lies not in overt control but in contextual framing, the subtle cues that guide interpretation without dictating conclusions. Lila Chen is tasked with coordinating audience interaction for the special, including live polls and social media prompts, and as she designs questions that invite viewers to weigh in on plausibility rather than truth, she feels increasingly complicit in a system that equates engagement with understanding, yet she also senses an opportunity to observe belief formation in real time, turning the machinery inward as a form of ethnography. Maria Alvarez, still withdrawn from public life, becomes an unexpected focal point when rumors circulate that she has destroyed the toast, an act framed by some as sacrilege and by others as an admission of fraud, and this polarization draws her back into the public eye against her will. Reporters camp outside her home seeking confirmation, forcing her to confront the reality that absence, too, is interpreted, and often harshly. In My Narrative, Maria ultimately grants a brief interview to a local journalist known for restraint, not to defend the authenticity of the image but to articulate a boundary, explaining that the meaning of the experience was personal and that its value did not increase with exposure, a statement that resonates quietly with some viewers while infuriating others who feel entitled to proof. The special episode's production intensifies, night shoots intercut with studio debates, and the forest near the tracks becomes a stage once more, illuminated by portable lights and infrared cameras, transforming a natural space into a theatrical set where anticipation itself becomes a character. Aaron is invited to appear but hesitates, recalling how his previous participation left him feeling hollow, yet he agrees under the condition that he will not be asked to speculate beyond what he remembers, a condition the producers accept while knowing that silence can be as evocative as conjecture. Julian arrives with equipment and confidence, prepared to demonstrate alternative analyses, and his interactions with Dr. Henry Wallace are charged with mutual skepticism, each representing a different epistemology, one grounded in institutional science, the other in decentralized inquiry, and their exchanges are framed by the show as respectful debate, though the editing later emphasizes tension to heighten drama. Lila observes these dynamics from the control room, noting how conflict sustains attention more effectively than consensus, and she begins to wonder whether the show could ever afford to reach a definitive conclusion without undermining its own premise. As filming progresses, unexpected complications arise when a group of enthusiasts attempts to access the site independently, drawn by live updates and speculation, forcing production to coordinate with local authorities, and this intrusion underscores a growing theme. The story has escaped containment, its gravitational pull drawing participants beyond the screen into physical space. Aaron witnesses this convergence firsthand, watching strangers comb the forest with flashlights, calling out, and he feels a surge of responsibility mixed with resentment, questioning whether his decision to record that night set in motion a chain of events he can no longer influence. The Jesus Toast narrative re-enters the episode through archival footage and commentary, positioned as a counterpoint to the Bigfoot investigation, and theologians and psychologists debate the nature of science, the human tendency to seek patterns, and the comfort derived from perceiving intention in randomness, yet these discussions are intercut with viewer reactions, emphasizing emotion over abstraction. Maria's interview airs briefly, her calm demeanor contrasting with the fervor surrounding her, and for a moment the episode pauses to acknowledge the human cost of spectacle, though this acknowledgement is fleeting, subsumed by the momentum of the larger mystery. Julian presents a revised analysis suggesting the train figure could be a coordinated prank involving multiple individuals, a theory that sparks outrage among believers and intrigue among skeptics, and the show treats this as a revelation without endorsing it, maintaining its characteristic balance of possibility without commitment. Dr. Wallace responds by emphasizing methodological rigor, cautioning against overfitting narratives to incomplete data, and his words resonate differently depending on the viewer's predisposition, reinforcing the idea that evidence rarely changes minds, only reinforces existing frameworks. Lila watches audience metrics spike during moments of disagreement, confirming her suspicion that the show's structure rewards division, and she begins to draft an internal proposal advocating for a segment focused explicitly on uncertainty itself, not as a tease but as a subject worthy of examination, though she doubts it will survive executive review. As the special draws to a close, the forest remains silent, no definitive anomaly captured, yet the episode feels climactic because the convergence of perspectives creates the illusion of progress, a sense that something has been approached even if not grasped. Aaron speaks briefly on camera, describing how the experience has taught him that seeing is only the beginning, that what follows is interpretation layered upon interpretation, and his words are edited to emphasize introspection, offering a rare moment of sincerity amid spectacle. Maria watches the broadcast from her living room, feeling both relief and weary, aware that the story will continue without her input, and she resolves to reclaim her private rituals, refusing to let them be defined by external scrutiny. Julian's participation cements his status, his subscriber count soaring, and he announces further investigations, demonstrating how engagement begets expansion, while Dr. Wallace returns to his academic work, troubled but resolved to continue engaging publicly despite the compromises involved. Part 4 closes with Lila alone in the control room after the broadcast, the monitors dark, reflecting her own face, and she contemplates the paradox at the heart of the proof is out there, that a show ostensibly about evidence thrives on its absence, that mystery is most profitable when it remains unsolved, and that in inviting audiences to search for proof, it has created a culture where the search itself becomes the point, a perpetual motion machine of doubt and desire. Outside, the night settles over the tracks and the forest, unchanged by attention, indifferent to interpretation, while trains continue to pass, their rhythm steady, and somewhere between motion and stillness, between belief and skepticism, the story waits, not for answers, but for the next person willing to look and wonder. Part 5 turns inward, examining the slow erosion of certainty that occurs not through dramatic revelation but through prolonged exposure to ambiguity, and in this section the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus' narrative becomes less about external phenomena and more about the internal negotiations each character makes with belief, doubt, and identity, as the proof is out there continues to operate like a low-frequency signal, subtle yet persistent, reshaping how reality is processed over time. In the weeks following the mid-season special, Aaron Cole notices that the attention surrounding him has not disappeared so much as diffused, settling into a background hum that accompanies him everywhere, and though no cameras follow him now, he feels observed in an abstract sense, as if his actions are still being interpreted by an invisible audience, and this awareness alters his behavior in ways he resents, making him more cautious, less spontaneous, his movements measured as if he is unconsciously preserving continuity with the version of himself viewers expect. He catches himself rehearsing explanations for mundane decisions, imagining how they might be framed, and this self-surveillance unsettles him, because it mirrors the show's method, turning lived experience into potential evidence. At work, the teasing has faded into an uneasy respect, co-workers careful not to provoke controversy, and Aaron realizes that the story has placed him in a liminal role, neither celebrity nor anonymous, a witness without authority, whose value lies in remaining unchanged while everything around him adapts. Lila Chen, meanwhile, is promoted quietly, her success measured not in public recognition but in trust from executives who see her as someone who understands the audience intuitively, and this advancement deepens her conflict, because she is now closer to decision-making power, closer to shaping narratives she increasingly questions. She attends strategy meetings where the language of curiosity is openly intertwined with metrics, phrases like lean into uncertainty and optimize mystery retention, used without irony, and she recognizes how thoroughly ambiguity has been commodified, transformed from a philosophical condition into a resource to be mined. Lila begins to collect viewer correspondence, emails, and messages that bypass public comment sections, and reading them late at night she is struck by their intimacy, people confiding fears, hopes, and moments of vulnerability sparked by the show, describing how episodes prompt conversations with family members about faith, mortality, and the unknown, and she realizes that while the program manipulates uncertainty, it also creates genuine spaces for reflection, complicating any simple moral judgment. Maria Alvarez receives fewer direct inquiries now, but their tone has shifted, less accusatory and more pleading, strangers asking her to share what she felt when she saw the image, not to prove its authenticity but to articulate its meaning, and this shift both softens and burdens her, because it invites her to become an interpreter of experience rather than a reluctant exhibit. She responds selectively, writing letters instead of granting interviews, choosing words carefully, emphasizing that meaning is not transferable like data, that what comforted her may not comfort another, and though these letters are often shared online without her consent, stripped of context, they nonetheless seed a quieter discourse that values subjectivity over spectacle. Julian Marks capitalizes on his elevated status by launching a serialized investigation series, each episode ending with a cliffhanger, and although he insists he is pursuing truth, his format mirrors the very television structures he critiques, reinforcing the idea that mystery must be paced to sustain attention, and he struggles privately with the pressure to deliver revelations on schedule, feeling his curiosity harden into obligation. His analysis grows more elaborate, incorporating psychological profiling of witnesses and speculative reconstructions, and some of his longtime followers express discomfort, accusing him of drifting from evidence toward narrative, a criticism that unsettles him because it reflects his own doubts about the integrity of his work. Dr. Henry Wallace publishes an op-ed discussing the ethical challenges of engaging with popular mystery programming, arguing that scientists must balance accessibility with rigor, and his piece sparks debate within his field, some praising his outreach, others warning that participation in such formats legitimizes misinformation, and this professional friction mirrors the broader cultural tension between expertise and entertainment. The producers of The Proof Is Out There seize on this discourse as potential content, considering a meta-episode focus on the controversy surrounding the show itself, though they frame it as transparency rather than self-critique, aware that reflexivity can enhance credibility without requiring structural change. Aaron is contacted about participating in this potential episode and declines, citing fatigue, and his refusal is respected superficially while quietly reframed in internal discussions as an example of witness burnout, a concept the producers consider exploring to add psychological depth to future segments. The forest near the tracks experiences a brief surge in visitors, then settles back into relative obscurity, yet its status as a symbolic site endures, mentioned in forums and videos as a touchstone for discussions about liminality and modern myth, and I described it in part 5 with seasonal detail, leaves changing, undergrowth thinning, emphasizing time's passage as a counterpoint to the story's cyclical nature. Lila visits the site alone one afternoon, not as part of production but out of personal curiosity, and standing there without equipment or agenda, she feels the absence of narrative pressure, the quiet indifference of the landscape, and this encounter becomes a private corrective to her professional immersion, reminding her that meaning is not inherent in places but assigned through attention. Maria's faith undergoes a subtle transformation, less centered on seeking reassurance and more on acceptance of uncertainty, and she finds solace in the idea that not knowing can coexist with belief, a realization that aligns ironically with the show's ethos while diverging sharply from its exploitative tendencies. Julian's series reaches a critical juncture when he presents a composite theory synthesizing natural, human, and perceptual explanations, a theory that satisfies few completely, and the mixed reception forces him to confront the reality that audiences invested in mystery often resist resolution, preferring the openness of possibility to the closure of explanation. Lila observes engagement metrics plateau around Julian's tentative conclusions, reinforcing the pattern she has seen repeatedly, that answers dampen enthusiasm, while questions invigorate it, and this realization crystallizes her unease into a decision to propose a radical experiment, an episode designed to reach a definitive conclusion, regardless of its impact on ratings. She drafts the proposal carefully, framing it as a test of audience appetite for closure, aware that its acceptance would challenge the show's foundational assumptions, and she prepares herself for rejection. Aaron, feeling the weight of unresolved narrative fade slightly with time, begins to reclaim aspects of his identity unrelated to the sighting, taking up an old hobby, restoring a motorcycle, engaging in tactile, grounded work that anchors him in the present, and this return to material reality contrasts sharply with the abstract debates still swirling online. Maria hosts a small gathering at her home, friends and neighbors sharing food and conversation, and the toast is mentioned only obliquely, its significance absorbed into a broader discussion of resilience and community, illustrating how experiences lose their charged intensity when reintegrated into everyday life. Dr. Wallace mentors a graduate student interested in studying the cultural impact of mystery media, and through their discussions he articulates a cautious optimism, suggesting that while such programs blur lines, they also reveal a widespread hunger for epistemological engagement, a desire to grapple with uncertainty rather than retreat into dogma. The producers review Lila's proposal and debate its merits, some intrigued by the novelty, others concerned about undermining the brand, and the decision is postponed, a familiar deferral that maintains equilibrium. Part 5 closes not with a revelation but with a gradual quieting, characters settling into uneasy truces with ambiguity, recognizing that certainty may be less attainable than livable uncertainty, and the proof is out there continues its steady broadcast rhythm, episodes airing, questions posed, answers withheld, while trains keep moving through forests, bread continues to toast in kitchens, and the human impulse to look for meaning persists, not because proof is promised, but because the act of searching has become a way of being, a habit of attention shaped by screens and stories, and in that habit lies both the danger and the strange comfort that define this modern mythology. Part 6 explores escalation through normalization, the paradoxical phase where the extraordinary becomes routine and yet more destabilizing precisely because it is no longer shocking, and in this movement of the narrative the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus' storyline enters a mature stage of myth, no longer driven by novelty but sustained by infrastructure, habits, and expectations that quietly reshape how truth itself is negotiated. The Proof is Out There continues to air weekly, and although new mysteries rotate through the program, the shadow of the train footage remains present as a reference point, a kind of baseline anomaly against which newer claims are measured, and this persistence reveals how unresolved stories embed themselves into collective memory, functioning less as questions than as coordinates. Aaron Cole notices this when a new episode features a different alleged cryptid sighting and co-workers glance at him instinctively, as if he is now a permanent category rather than a person, and though the attention is casual, even affectionate, it reinforces the sense that his identity has been subtly archived, indexed under unexplained phenomena. He feels less anger now and more fatigue, a dull awareness that narratives, once released, do not dissipate but sediment, layering over time, and this realization pushes him toward introspection rather than resistance. Lila Chan's proposal for a closure-focused episode is formally declined, though executives praise her initiative, explaining that the brand's strength lies in ongoing inquiry, a phrase that rings hollow to her because it masks economic logic behind epistemological rhetoric, and she begins to consider whether her discomfort can coexist with her role or whether she must eventually choose between influence and integrity. She starts informal conversations with editors and junior producers, probing their perceptions, and discovers a spectrum of attitudes, some openly cynical, others sincerely believing that the show provides a valuable service by modeling curiosity, and this diversity complicates her impulse to condemn the system outright, suggesting instead that the machinery persists not because of malice but because of distributor incentives that align convenience with ambiguity. Maria Alvarez's quiet correspondence gains unexpected traction when excerpts of her letters circulate widely, quoted not as proof but as testimony, and though this dissemination still occurs without her control, the tone shifts noticeably, readers responding with reflections of their own, less interested in verifying the image than in discussing how moments of perceived grace emerge in ordinary life. Maria reads these responses cautiously, aware that meaning can be co-opted as easily as evidence, yet she senses a fragile countercurrent forming, one that values interior experience without demanding external validation, and she nurtures this by continuing to write privately, refusing invitations to formalize her role as a spiritual commentator. Julian Marks, facing diminishing returns from perpetual analysis, experiments with a different approach, releasing a video that openly addresses his uncertainty, acknowledging the emotional pull of mystery and his own susceptibility to narrative temptation, and the response is polarized, some praising his honesty, others accusing him of retreating from rigor. And this reaction underscores a central tension of the era: vulnerability is celebrated rhetorically but penalized algorithmically. Dr. Henry Wallace observes these developments from a distance, increasingly convinced that the true subject of the proof is out there is not anomalous events but epistemic anxiety, the unease produced by living in a world saturated with information yet starved of consensus, and he begins drafting a book that situates such programs within a historical continuum of wonder literature, arguing that they function as secular sermons, offering structured uncertainty in place of doctrinal certainty. The producers, sensing a slight cooling of audience intensity around the original sighting, introduce a retrospective montage segment, recapping key moments from the Bigfoot train sighting narrative, and the act of retrospection reframes the story as heritage rather than crisis, inviting viewers to reminisce rather than debate, a subtle shift that signals institutional confidence in the myth's endurance. Aaron watches this montage unexpectedly one evening and is struck by how his own image appears younger, more tentative, and he feels a disconnect between their archived self and his present reality, a temporal dissonance that prompts him to consider how media freezes moments while life continues to move, and this awareness grants him a measure of detachment, allowing him to see the narrative as something that happened to him rather than something he still inhabits. Lila notices that retrospectives perform well with long-term viewers, reinforcing loyalty, and she recognizes that the show is transitioning from exploratory to curatorial, managing a portfolio of mysteries rather than chasing singular breakthroughs, and this institutionalization of the unexplained feels both stabilizing and stifling. She begins to imagine alternative formats that could honor uncertainty without exploiting it, perhaps limited-run investigations with clear endpoints, but she knows such ideas challenge the logic of perpetual engagement that underpins network strategy. Maria experiences a personal turning point when she encounters a young woman at a community event who thanks her for writing, explaining that the letters helped her reconcile skepticism with faith without feeling deficient in either, and this interaction affirms Maria's instinct that meaning transmitted gently, without spectacle, can still resonate, offering her a sense of purpose divorced from proof. Julian's channel undergoes a subtle rebrand, shifting emphasis from debunking toward contextual exploration, examining folklore, psychology, and media dynamics, and while this attracts a smaller audience, it brings deeper engagement, prompting Julian to reassess his metrics of success, though financial pressures linger, reminding him that ideals exist within constraints. Dr. Wallace's book proposal is accepted by an academic press, and he outlines chapters that include the train sighting as a case study, not to resolve it but to demonstrate how unresolved phenomena function socially, shaping discourse, identity, and community formation, and he anticipates criticism from both skeptics and believers, accepting it as evidence that the subject occupies contested ground. The forest near the tracks fades further into seasonal anonymity, snow-muting undergrowth, transforming the landscape into a blank canvas that resists projection, and I describe this quiet as a counterpoint to the ongoing digital noise, emphasizing how physical spaces remain indifferent to narrative persistence. Lila returns to the site once more, this time with a notebook, documenting her impressions without intention to publish, and she reflects on how the absence of expectation alters perception, allowing her to experience the place as it is rather than as it signifies, and this private act of attention feels restorative, a reclaiming of curiosity from commodification. Aaron's life stabilizes, his sense of self re-anchored in routine and tangible projects, and though the sighting remains part of his history, it no longer defines his future, illustrating how unresolved experiences can be integrated without resolution, a lesson that contrasts sharply with the show's ongoing deferral. Maria continues her correspondence quietly, Julian navigates his evolving platform, Dr. Wallace writes, and Lila remains within the system, reflective but not resigned, each character negotiating a personal equilibrium with uncertainty. The proof is out there persists, its episodes airing, its questions posed, its tone measured, and Part 6 closes on the recognition that the show's true power lies not in what it proves or disproves but in how it trains attention, cultivating a cultural posture of suspended judgment that can be either enriching or exhausting depending on how it is lived. Trains continue to move through the night, kitchens continue their morning rituals, screens glow with paused frames awaiting interpretation, and the world hums with unanswered questions that no longer demand urgency but endure as background conditions of modern consciousness, shaping how people look, listen, and wonder, not in pursuit of final answers, but in accommodation to a reality where ambiguity has become not an interruption but a constant companion. Part 7 moves into a phase of confrontation, not between belief and skepticism, but between individuals and the quiet consequences of having lived too long inside an unresolved story, where the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a narrative begins to press against the private limits of endurance, forcing each character to decide not what they believe, but how much ambiguity they are willing to carry forward into the rest of their lives. The proof is out there continues without interruption, its cadence familiar, its tone reassuringly inquisitive, yet beneath this surface stability, fractures appear, subtle but consequential, as the machinery of perpetual uncertainty collides with human thresholds. Aaron Cole experiences this fracture first in his body rather than his thoughts, a persistent tightness in his chest during long night shifts, an unease that surfaces whenever he hears the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rail, and though medical tests reveal nothing abnormal, he senses that his nervous system has memorized vigilance, trained by months of attention to expect significance where there may be none. He recognizes that while he has intellectually moved on, some part of him remains attuned to the possibility of anomaly, scanning the edges of perception, and this involuntary readiness exhausts him, prompting him to seek ways to quiet his mind, not through denial of the experience but through acceptance of its unresolved nature. He begins taking long walks without his phone, an act that feels radical, reclaiming unrecorded time, and during these walks he reflects on how easily a single moment can colonize consciousness when amplified by repetition, how the story of the sighting became larger than the sighting itself, and this realization carries both relief and regret. Lila Chen reaches a parallel threshold professionally, when a proposed episode framing a new alleged miracle deliberately echoes the structure of the Jesus Toast segment, prompting her to confront the show's pattern of aestheticizing faith-adjacent experiences without engaging their ethical complexity, and she voices her concerns more openly than before during a production meeting. Her objections are met with polite deflection, assurances that sensitivity consultants will be involved, and though she recognizes this as institutional language designed to neutralize dissent, she also notices a shift, a subtle acknowledgement that the internal consensus around ambiguity is not as unassailable as it once seemed. This moment emboldens her to request a temporary rotation to a different project, not as an escape but as a means of gaining perspective, and while her request is granted, it is framed as professional development rather than philosophical divergence, preserving the appearance of alignment. Maria Alvarez encounters confrontation in a more intimate form when a close friend confesses discomfort with the way Maria's experience has been discussed publicly, expressing concern that their attention has burdened her with expectations she never sought, and this honest conversation allows Maria to articulate something she has only half-formed until now, that the real harm was not skepticism or belief, but the insistence that her experience must serve a broader narrative, whether as evidence or inspiration. She realizes that reclaiming agency requires not only withdrawal from spectacle but active redefinition of meaning on her own terms, and she begins to write a private account of the experience, not for publication but for clarity, documenting not what appeared on the toast but how it felt, how it intersected with grief, routine, and prayer, and this act of narration feels restorative, disentangling memory from interpretation imposed by others. Julian Marks confronts a different reckoning when a longtime collaborator leaves his channel, citing creative differences and fatigue with sustained uncertainty as content, and this departure forces Julian to acknowledge that his work, though framed as inquiry, has become an endurance test for both creator and audience, reliant on the constant generation of suspense. He reflects on how his identity has fused with the role of investigator, how stepping back feels like abandonment, and yet he senses that continuing indefinitely risks hollowing out the curiosity that initially drew him to the footage. Julian experiments with a finite series model, announcing a final installment on the train sighting that will summarize his findings without teasing further developments, and the announcement triggers anxiety among followers accustomed to open-endedness, revealing how deeply the expectation of continuation has been internalized. Dr. Henry Wallace observes these individual reckonings as data points in a broader pattern, noting how prolonged exposure to unresolved narratives produces fatigue distinct from skepticism or belief, a weariness born not of contradiction but of suspension, and he integrates this observation into his writing, arguing that cultures can become overstimulated by possibility, craving not certainty but rest. He presents these ideas at a conference, encountering resistance from colleagues who fear legitimizing ambiguity as a cultural norm, yet he maintains that acknowledging uncertainty's psychological cost is a prerequisite for ethical engagement with mystery. The proof is out there itself reflects this tension subtly in its presentation, incorporating more segments that emphasize process over outcome, investigation over revelation, and though this shift is marketed as depth, it also signals an awareness that audiences are seeking something different, perhaps a slower, more reflective engagement with the unknown. Aaron notices this tonal change when he watches an episode late one night, struck by how familiar the cadence feels yet how distant he now feels from it, as if he has aged out of a particular mode of attention, and he turns off the television midway through, an act that feels neither defiant nor dismissive, simply complete. Lila, working on her temporary assignment, finds herself missing the intensity of her previous role even as she appreciates the respite, and this ambivalence clarifies her understanding that systems shape behavior not only through coercion but through meaning, offering participants a sense of purpose that can be difficult to relinquish. Maria completes her private account and shares it selectively with trusted friends, discovering that the act of sharing without expectation of amplification restores intimacy to the narrative, allowing it to exist without performance. Julian releases his final installment as promised, summarizing evidence, acknowledging gaps, and explicitly resisting speculation, and while viewership dips compared to earlier episodes, the response includes messages of gratitude from viewers relieved by closure, suggesting that beneath their appetite for mystery lies an unspoken desire for containment. Dr. Wallace revises his manuscript to include these developments, framing them as evidence that unresolved narratives are not infinitely sustainable, that human attention, though adaptable, seeks equilibrium. As Part 7 draws to a close, the characters occupy a shared but uncoordinated moment of recalibration, each renegotiating their relationship with uncertainty, not by resolving it, but by setting boundaries around its influence. The forest remains unchanged, the tracks steady, the toast long since gone, yet the residue of the story persists as memory rather than urgency, and the proof is out there continues, its questions intact, its tone measured, but now situated within a cultural landscape increasingly aware of the cost of perpetual wonder. The part ends not with a dramatic shift, but with a collective exhale, a recognition that while mystery may be inexhaustible, attention is not, and that learning when to stop looking can be as meaningful as learning how to look, a lesson emerging quietly from the long arc of a story that began with a shadow beside a train and unfolded into a meditation on how modern lives are shaped by the spaces between knowing and not knowing. Part 8 enters a reflective aftermath, a phase where the story no longer advances through escalation but through resonance, showing how unresolved narratives leave behind patterns of thought that continue to shape choices long after public attention drifts elsewhere, and in this section the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a thread becomes a kind of sediment in each character's life, invisible yet influential, shaping how they respond to new uncertainties beyond the reach of the proof is out there. Aaron co-experiences this when a minor incident occurs on the rails, a routine malfunction that delays a train and triggers a brief investigation, and he notices how quickly speculation spreads among workers, theories multiplying before facts are confirmed, and instead of being irritated he feels a quiet recognition, seeing in their behavior a miniature version of what he lived through. The human impulse to fill gaps immediately, and he consciously resists adding his voice, choosing patience over narrative, realizing that his experience has not made him cynical but cautious, more attuned to the difference between observation and interpretation. This restraint marks a subtle maturation, a learned discipline born not from instruction but from lived consequence. Lila Chen returns from her rotation with altered perspective, less reactive and more strategic, and she begins to advocate for structural changes rather than symbolic gestures, proposing limited arc investigations and clearer demarcations between evidence and conjecture, framing these ideas not as ethical imperatives but as innovations that could differentiate the program in a saturated media landscape. Her proposals are met with mixed reactions, some colleagues intrigued, others skeptical, yet the conversation itself represents progress, signaling that the culture within the show is no longer monolithic, and Lila understands that change, if it comes, will be incremental, negotiated through language and framing rather than confrontation. Maria Alvarez's life settles into a quieter rhythm, her correspondence tapering naturally, and she returns fully to her routines, prayer, community work, shared meals, yet she notices that her relationship to faith has subtly shifted, less reliant on reassurance and more comfortable with silence, and when she encounters new stories of alleged miracles circulating online, she feels neither attraction nor dismissal, only a gentle detachment, recognizing how easily all can be outsourced to spectacle, and she chooses instead to anchor meaning in presence, an act of quiet resistance against the demand for science. Julian Marks, having concluded his investigation, faces the challenge of redefining his platform, experimenting with content that explores uncertainty as a condition rather than a puzzle, and though his audience is smaller, engagement is deeper, conversations more nuanced, and he begins to see his role less as a solver of mysteries and more as a facilitator of inquiry, a shift that brings both financial insecurity and intellectual relief. He reflects often on the train footage, now rarely revisited, and realizes that its power lay not in what it showed but in how it revealed his own susceptibility to momentum, teaching him the necessity of stopping points, of endings that allow thought to settle. Dr. Henry Wallace's book enters peer review, and feedback challenges him to clarify his stance, to articulate whether he views programs like The Proof is Out There as symptoms or drivers of epistemic anxiety, and this critique forces him to refine his argument, acknowledging a feedback loop rather than a linear causality, media both reflecting and shaping cultural uncertainty, and he revises his work to emphasize agency, arguing that audiences are not merely manipulated but participate actively in sustaining ambiguity, a participation that carries both empowerment and responsibility. The show itself introduces subtle visual changes, fewer dramatic sound cues, more explicit disclaimers, adjustments small enough to be deniable yet noticeable to attentive viewers, and while these changes do not resolve its foundational paradox, they suggest an awareness of critique, an adaptation that mirrors the character's own recalibrations. Aaron watches an episode featuring a new witness and feels empathy rather than identification, recognizing the familiar mixture of sincerity and vulnerability, and he hopes silently that this person will find a way to integrate the experience without being consumed by it, a hope born from hindsight rather than certainty. Lila mentors a junior analyst who expresses discomfort with manipulating audience emotion, and instead of offering reassurance she shares her own doubts, modeling a form of professional honesty that does not demand resolution, and this exchange underscores a quiet transmission of values within the system, small acts that may not transform the structure but influence its future occupants. Maria attends a memorial service for a community member, and as stories are shared she notices how meaning is constructed collectively, memory shaped through repetition and selection, and she understands that all narratives, sacred or secular, function this way, gaining coherence not from proof but from shared recognition, and this insight reconciles her experience with the broader human tendency to narrate life into significance. Julian received an invitation to consult on a documentary unrelated to cryptids, focus instead on the psychology of belief, and he accepts, seeing in it an opportunity to apply lessons learned rather than repeat patterns, and he reflects on how stepping away from a single mystery has expanded rather than diminished his curiosity. Dr. Wallace delivers a public lecture drawn from his book, and audience questions reveal a spectrum of responses, some defensive, others grateful, and he recognizes that his work, like the show he studies, does not settle debates but reframes them, offering language where there was previously only reaction. As Part 8 unfolds, the Bigfoot train sighting recedes further into the background, referenced occasionally but no longer central, and this fading does not feel like loss but like integration, the story absorbed into a broader understanding of how modern myths operate, how they arise, persist, and eventually soften into context. The forest remains, seasons cycling, indifferent to narrative closure, and trains continue their passage, metal against rail, sound against silence, a reminder that most movement occurs without witnesses, without documentation, without interpretation, and that this unrecorded reality holds its own quiet integrity. The Proof is Out There continues to broadcast, its title unchanged, its premise intact, yet its impact now understood by those touched by the earlier story not as a source of answers but as a lens that once sharpened and then distorted their attention, teaching them, through fatigue and reflection, the importance of balance. Part 8 closes on this tempered awareness, a recognition that mystery need not be solved to be respected, that uncertainty can be lived with rather than performed, and that stepping back from the endless demand for proof allows space for a different kind of understanding, one grounded not in spectacle but in discernment, patience, and the humility to accept that some questions are not meant to be pursued indefinitely, but to be acknowledged, carried lightly, and then set down. Part 9 moves into a phase of reckoning through distance, where time itself becomes the primary force reshaping meaning, and the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus' narrative is examined not through renewed investigation but through the way it lingers as a reference point in moments that seem, on the surface, unrelated, revealing how unresolved stories quietly reorganize values long after they stop commanding attention. In this part, the story no longer belongs to the Proof is Out There alone but to the broader cultural memory that absorbed it, digested it imperfectly, and now carries its aftertaste into new encounters with uncertainty. Aaron Cole experiences this reckoning during a routine safety seminar for new rail employees, where he is asked, almost jokingly, to share that story, and the request, casual and well-intentioned, forces him to recognize how the sighting has been fossilized into anecdote, a cautionary tale or curiosity rather than an active mystery. As he recounts the event briefly, stripped of drama, focusing on what he knows rather than what he does not, he feels a sense of closure not because the question is answered but because the telling no longer costs him anything emotionally, and this shift signals a deep internal change, the transformation of an experience from identity to memory. Lila Chen, now more established in her role, observes how the show's audience responds to a new wave of mysteries with a slightly altered posture, less explosive, more conversational, and she wonders whether this reflects broader media fatigue or the cumulative effect of years spent negotiating ambiguity, and she finds herself increasingly interested in longitudinal patterns rather than episodic spikes, tracking how viewers' language evolves over time, noting a gradual increase in meta commentary, people discussing not only what might be true but how stories make them feel, suggesting a growing self-awareness shaped partly by the very programs that once thrived on unexamined wonder. Maria Alvarez encounters the residue of the story unexpectedly when a young relative asks her about the toast, having discovered it through an old clip, and instead of feeling exposed, Maria responds calmly, framing the moment as one of comfort rather than revelation, emphasizing that its importance lay in timing, not imagery, and this explanation satisfies the child without inviting further scrutiny, demonstrating how meaning can be transmitted without spectacle when guided by intention. Julian Marks attends a conference on digital culture and belief, where his past work is referenced by others, and hearing his analysis discussed at a distance unsettles him, because it reveals how easily one becomes a source rather than a participant, and he recognizes the responsibility that comes with leaving artifacts behind in the information ecosystem, artifacts that persist independently of his current views. He speaks candidly during a panel about the difficulty of ending investigations in an attention economy, admitting that closure often feels like failure, and his honesty resonates with others navigating similar pressures, reinforcing the idea that unresolved narratives are sustained not only by audiences but by creators afraid to stop. Dr. Henry Wallace's book is published to measured acclaim, praised for its nuance and criticized for its refusal to take a definitive stance, and he accepts both responses as evidence that his argument has landed where it should, in the contested space between explanation and interpretation. And he reflects privately that the Bigfoot train sighting chapter has become less about the sighting itself and more about the mirror it holds up to readers' assumptions, a mirror that some find clarifying and others discomforting. The proof is out there as a commemorative episode marking an anniversary of the series, featuring brief callbacks to earlier segments, including the train footage, now presented with a tone of nostalgia rather than urgency. And this reframing illustrates how mystery ages, how questions that once felt pressing can become emblematic, symbols of a period rather than problems to be solved. Lila watches this episode with a sense of professional detachment tinged with personal recognition, aware of her own role in shaping these arcs, and she notes how the audience responds warmly to the familiar uncertainty, suggesting that unresolved stories can offer comfort through continuity, a reliable form of not knowing that contrasts with the chaos of unstructured doubt elsewhere in life. Aaron, watching the same episode at home, feels no compulsion to revisit the footage, content to let it pass, and this indifference surprises him, confirming that his relationship to the story has fundamentally changed, that he no longer needs it to mean anything beyond what it already has. Maria's correspondence dwindles further, and she redirects her energy toward mentoring within her community, finding fulfillment in presence rather than narrative, and she reflects that faith, like memory, matures when it is allowed to become ordinary again, freed from the pressure to astonish. Julian begins teaching a short course on media literacy and belief, using his own work as a case study, and guiding students through the mechanics of ambiguity, demonstrating how pacing, framing, and repetition influence perception, and he finds this pedagogical role unexpectedly grounding, offering a way to transform experience into insight rather than content. Dr. Wallace receives letters from readers who describe feeling less alone in their uncertainty after reading his book, and he recognizes that while answers remain elusive, shared language can reduce isolation, an outcome he values more than consensus. As Part 9 unfolds, the story's emotional intensity dissipates into something quieter and more durable, a shared understanding among those touched by it that not all questions demand pursuit, that some can be acknowledged and then contextualized within a larger life. The forest, now firmly in the background, appears briefly in a closing image, a wide, unremarkable shot devoid of implication, emphasizing that places do not carry stories on their own, they are assigned, revisited, and eventually released. The proof is out there continues, its format unchanged, its title still provocative, yet its earlier mysteries now function as reference points rather than drivers, markers of a collective learning curve. Part 9 closes with a sense of settling, not resolution but perspective, the characters having learned to carry uncertainty without letting it dominate, to remember without reanimating, and to recognize that meaning, once extracted from experience, does not require constant reinforcement to endure, because the most significant transformations often occur quietly, in the space where attention relaxes and life resumes its unremarkable, resilient flow, carrying forward lessons that no longer announce themselves but continue to guide choices in subtle, enduring ways. Part 10 returns to the question of legacy, not as something deliberately constructed but as something that accumulates through repetition, omission, and quiet reinterpretation. And in this section, the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus' narrative is no longer treated as a living inquiry but as a residue that subtly informs decisions, ethics, and expectations across time, revealing how unresolved stories leave behind frameworks rather than answers. Aaron Cole encounters this legacy unexpectedly when his rail company introduces new guidelines about employee use of personal recording devices, citing safety and privacy concerns, and while the policy is not explicitly linked to his experience, the implication is unmistakable, and he recognizes that his moment of instinctive documentation has become part of an institutional memory that now shapes rules for others. He feels neither pride nor resentment, only a quiet awareness of consequence, and during a training session he speaks briefly about judgment, about knowing when to record and when to simply observe, emphasizing responsibility over reaction, and the trainees listen attentively, not because of the mystery attached to his story, but because of the calm authority he has gained through reflection, and this shift affirms that meaning can be transmitted through tone rather than spectacle. Lila Chen, increasingly influential within the network, is asked to contribute to a long-term strategy document outlining the future direction of The Proof Is Out There, and as she reviews past episodes, including the train sighting and the Jesus toast, she notices how language has evolved subtly over seasons, qualifiers multiplying, claims softened, a linguistic drift that mirrors her own internal evolution. She proposes codifying this shift, recommending clearer distinctions between evidence, interpretation, and speculation, framing it as a trust-building measure rather than an ethical correction, and while some executives resist formal constraints, others recognize the growing cultural appetite for transparency, and the debate itself signals a turning point, an acknowledgement that perpetual ambiguity, once novel, now requires stewardship. Maria Alvarez experiences legacy through absence, when she realizes that months have passed without anyone mentioning the toast, and instead of relief she feels a brief pang of loss, recognizing that even unwanted attention can confer a sense of significance, and she reflects on how easily validation becomes entwined with visibility. This awareness leads her to examine other areas of her life where she has unconsciously equated recognition with worth, and she begins a practice of deliberate anonymity, volunteering in roles where her name is not attached to outcomes, finding in this obscurity a grounding satisfaction that contrasts sharply with the earlier period of unwanted prominence. Julian Mark's legacy becomes tangible when he is invited to consult on content moderation policies for a digital platform, his experience with runaway speculation considered valuable, and he approaches the task cautiously, advocating not for suppression of mystery but for friction, small pauses and contextual prompts that encourage reflection before amplification, and he recognizes that this approach, incremental and procedural, lacks the drama of investigation but may have broader impact. Translating lessons learned from a single story into systemic safeguards. Dr. Henry Wallace observes the afterlife of his book through citations and critiques, noting how readers selectively extract arguments to support existing positions, and he accepts this as an inevitable feature of discourse, recognizing that ideas, once released, function much like the footage he analyzed, subject to reframing beyond the author's control, and this realization deepens his empathy for witnesses like Aaron and Maria, whose experiences were similarly recontextualized. The Proof Is Out There produces an episode explicitly addressing the concept of legacy, examining how past mysteries influence current interpretations, and the train sighting is mentioned briefly as an example of a case that shaped audience expectations, not because of what it proved, but because of how it was discussed, and this meta-commentary marks a maturation of the show's self-awareness, though it remains careful not to undermine its foundational allure. Lila watches audience responses to this episode and notices a bifurcation, some viewers appreciative of reflection, others impatient, longing for fresher anomalies, and she understands that any evolution of format will involve trade-offs, gains in depth accompanied by losses in immediacy. Aaron, now largely detached from the public narrative, is approached by a local journalist researching the history of the sighting for a retrospective article, and he agrees to speak on the condition that the piece focus on process rather than speculation, and when it is published, he reads it with measured interest, noting how his words are contextualized, not sensationalized, and this experience offers a belated sense of ethical closure, a demonstration that storytelling can honor restraint. Maria mentors a younger woman struggling with unwanted attention from a viral incident unrelated to faith, and drawing on her own experience, she advises patience and boundary setting, emphasizing that attention fades faster than identity shifts, and that protecting one's interior life is not an act of retreat but of preservation, and in offering this guidance she recognizes how her earlier discomfort has been transformed into wisdom applicable beyond its original context. Julian continues his educational work, and during a workshop he presents the train footage not as a mystery to be solved but as a case study in interpretive escalation, inviting participants to map how narratives grow through repetition, and the exercise reveals patterns that participants recognize in other domains, politics, health misinformation, personal relationships, and Julian realizes that the true value of the story lies in its transferability, its ability to illuminate dynamics that recur wherever uncertainty meets attention. Dr. Wallace received an invitation to advise on a public media literacy initiative, and he accepts, seeing an opportunity to translate academic insight into practical tools, and he reflects that while no single program can resolve epistemic anxiety, cumulative efforts can foster resilience, equipping people to live with uncertainty without being consumed by it. As Part 10 unfolds, the Bigfoot train sighting recedes almost entirely into reference, its imagery invoked less for its content than for its role in shaping habits of thought, and this attenuation feels appropriate, signaling that the story has completed its primary work, not by delivering answers, but by prompting a series of adaptations across individuals and institutions. The forests and tracks appear one last time in this section, not as sites of mystery but as ordinary infrastructure and landscape, and this ordinariness underscores a central insight of the narrative, that the extraordinary often dissolves back into the everyday, leaving behind not proof, but changed perspectives. The proof is out there continues, now carrying its own history as part of its identity, and its audience, shaped by years of engagement, approaches new stories with a mixture of curiosity and caution, a learned posture that reflects both growth and fatigue. Part 10 closes on the recognition that legacy is not about resolution or fame, but about influence, the subtle ways experiences propagate through policy, language, mentorship, and design, altering how future uncertainties are encountered, and that in this sense, the train sighting and the toes achieve a kind of proof after all, not proof of Bigfoot or divinity, but proof that stories, once amplified, reshape the terrain of attention, and that learning to navigate this terrain responsibly is an ongoing task, one that extends far beyond any single episode, clip, or belief, into the quiet, cumulative work of living thoughtfully in a world where not knowing has become both a challenge and a constant companion. Part 11 enters a reflective late stage of the narrative where uncertainty is no longer negotiated as tension or legacy but as atmosphere, something that quietly surrounds everyday decisions and informs them without demanding acknowledgement, and in this phase the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a threat functions like background radiation, invisible yet influential, shaping how the characters interpret new experiences that bear no obvious resemblance to the original mystery. Aaron Cole finds himself facing an unexpected test of this internalized change when a minor incident occurs along a rural stretch of track, a shadow misinterpreted by a junior employee as a potential obstruction, and as protocol demands investigation, Aaron notices the familiar ripple of speculation beginning to form, whispered possibilities and exaggerated retellings already circulating before any evidence is gathered. Instead of reacting with frustration or urgency, he slows the process deliberately, insisting on methodical verification, calmly dismantling assumptions without dismissing concern, and in doing so he realizes that his greatest contribution is no longer the story he once carried, but the example of composure he now embodies, demonstrating that caution and curiosity can coexist without feeding each other into distortion. The incident resolves mundanely, an Animal Crossing captured partially by light, and while some disappointment flickers among the crew, Aaron senses a collective relief, an unspoken appreciation for clarity unaccompanied by drama, and this moment affirms that cultures can change incrementally through repeated small choices rather than singular revelations. Lila Chen, navigating her role within a media landscape increasingly shaped by algorithmic incentives, becomes acutely aware of how subtle framing choices influence not only audience perception but also internal editorial culture, and during a content review meeting she challenges a proposed teaser that exaggerates ambiguity beyond what the segment can responsibly sustain. Her objection is met with polite resistance, justified by metrics and engagement forecasts, and yet she persists, articulating a vision of credibility as a long-term asset rather than a short-term variable, and although the final compromise is imperfect, she recognizes progress in the fact that such discussions are now possible at all. Their ethical considerations have gained a seat at the table rather than remaining an afterthought. Privately, Lila reflects on how her own fascination with mystery has matured, becoming less about the thrill of possibility and more about the craft of narration, the responsibility of guiding attention rather than merely capturing it, and she understands that this evolution mirrors that of the audience, many of whom now seek context as much as spectacle, suggesting a subtle but meaningful shift in cultural appetite. Maria Alvarez experiences Part 11 as a season of quiet testing, when a series of personal hardships converge, illness within her family, financial strain, and a sense of emotional fatigue, and she notices how different her internal responses are compared to earlier years, how she no longer looks for signs or symbolic reassurance, but instead allows herself to feel uncertainty without translating it into meaning. This restraint does not diminish her faith but grounds it, transforming belief from interpretation into practice, expressed through care, patience, and presence rather than narrative, and she realizes that the earlier public fixation on her experience taught her, indirectly, the cost of over-symbolizing life, a lesson she now applies gently, forgiving herself for moments of doubt without demanding resolution. Julian Marks encounters the persistence of mystery in an academic setting when a student challenges his framework, arguing that reducing anomalous stories to media dynamics risks dismissing the possibility of genuine unknowns, and Julian responds thoughtfully, acknowledging the concern while clarifying that skepticism toward narrative escalation does not equate to denial of uncertainty itself. He emphasizes that humility requires recognizing both the limits of evidence and the limits of interpretation, and that the danger lies not in wondering, but in prematurely stabilizing wonder into belief structures that resist revision, and this exchange invigorates him, reminding him that his work remains relevant precisely because it does not seek to close questions, but to keep them ethically open. Dr. Henry Wallace, now semi-retired, spends more time observing than producing, and he finds himself drawn to how often the language of proof has entered casual conversation, people speaking of evidence and verification even in personal disputes, and he wonders whether this reflects a healthier epistemic culture or merely the superficial adoption of scientific vocabulary. Reflecting on the train sighting chapter of his book, he recognizes that its enduring value lies not in conclusions but in modeling a way of thinking that tolerates ambiguity without surrendering rigor, and he feels a quiet satisfaction knowing that this model continues to circulate, imperfectly but persistently, through classrooms, discussions, and media commentary. The Proof is Out There undergoes subtle rebranding in this period, less in title than in tone, with segments increasingly framed as explorations rather than investigations, and while the distinction may seem semantic, it signals an internal recalibration, an acknowledgement that perpetual pursuit of answers can give way to sustained engagement with questions themselves. Audience feedback reflects this transition unevenly, some praising the maturity, others lamenting the loss of edge, and Lila studies these responses carefully, understanding that evolution always risks alienation, but also recognizing that stagnation poses a greater threat, and she commits to navigating this tension with transparency rather than nostalgia. Aaron, invited to speak at a regional safety conference, chooses not to mention the sighting at all, focusing instead on decision-making under uncertainty, and only during the informal discussion afterward does someone bring it up, and when he responds briefly, without embellishment, the conversation naturally shifts to broader topics, and he senses that the story has finally settled into its proper scale, no longer overshadowing his professional identity. Maria attends a community gathering where a guest speaker discusses the human tendency to search for meaning in randomness, and she listens with interest, recognizing echoes of her own journey, and when asked to share thoughts, she speaks simply about learning to live without constant interpretation, and her words resonate deeply with others who have struggled under the weight of expectation, suggesting that personal transformation, once integrated, can quietly liberate others without spectacle. Julian publishes an essay reflecting on the afterlife of viral mysteries, using the train sighting as a reference point among others, and the piece circulates modestly but steadily, attracting thoughtful commentary rather than outrage, and he takes this as a sign that the discourse has matured, that there is now space for nuance without immediate polarization. Dr. Wallace receives news that his book has been added to a recommended reading list for a media studies program, and while the recognition is gratifying, he is more moved by a note from a former student who writes that the book helped them feel less pressure to have definitive opinions, and this affirmation reinforces his belief that intellectual humility is not a weakness but a skill, one increasingly necessary in a world saturated with claims. As Part 11 progresses, the narrative becomes less about specific events and more about disposition, the cultivated ability to encounter uncertainty without reflexive escalation, and the characters' lives reflect this shift through their choices, responses, and silences. The forest appears again, briefly, not as a site of intrigue but as a place of seasonal change, leaves falling, light shifting, and this imagery underscores the central theme of transience, that mysteries, like environments, change meaning depending on how they are approached over time. The Proof is Out There continues its broadcast, now part of a larger media ecosystem increasingly self-aware of its influence, and while it still presents anomalies, it does so with a quieter confidence, trusting viewers to sit with complexity rather than demanding constant provocation. Part 11 closes with a sense of integration, the characters no longer defined by the mystery that once connected them, but subtly aligned by the ways they have learned to live with its residue, carrying forward not answers, but habits of thought, patience, discernment, and restraint, that shape their interactions with a world where the unknown remains ever present, not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a condition to be navigated with care, humility, and an enduring respect for the limits of what can be known. Part 12 serves as the quiet culmination of the narrative, not a climax in the traditional sense but a gradual settling into equilibrium, where the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a Story finally completes its transformation from event to context, from a focal point of attention into a background condition that no longer pulls at the characters' identities but instead frames their understanding of the world with a gentle, almost invisible influence. In this final part, the story does not seek to resolve the mystery, because resolution is no longer the appropriate language. Instead, it explores what remains after sustained exposure to uncertainty has reshaped perception, ethics, and emotional posture, revealing how people continue once the need for explanation loosens its grip. Aaron Cole approaches retirement, and in the closing months of his career he becomes acutely aware of how much his relationship with vigilance has evolved, noticing that younger colleagues look to him not for stories of anomalies but for guidance in maintaining balance under pressure. During his final evaluation, a supervisor remarks on his steady judgment and his ability to de-escalate speculative reactions, and Aaron recognizes that this capacity, once forged through unwanted attention, has become his most enduring professional contribution. On his last day, he walks a familiar stretch of track at dawn, the landscape quiet and unremarkable, and while the memory of the sighting surfaces briefly, it does so without urgency or emotional charge, simply as one moment among many, and he feels a deep sense of peace in knowing that the mystery no longer defines his narrative arc, having been absorbed into a broader understanding of attentiveness without obsession. Lila Chen oversees the production of a season finale for The Proof Is Out There that intentionally avoids grand revelations, instead revisiting several past cases, including the train sighting, through the lens of how public interpretation has shifted over time, and she frames the episode as an exploration of learning rather than discovery. In editorial meetings, she emphasizes that the goal is not to diminish wonder but to demonstrate that curiosity can mature, that it can coexist with restraint and reflection, and when the episode airs, audience reaction is subdued but thoughtful, marked by longer-form discussions rather than explosive commentary. Lila reads these responses late into the night, recognizing in them a mirror of her own journey, and she accepts that while this approach may never generate peak virality, it aligns with a deeper sense of responsibility she has come to value, understanding that guiding attention ethically is a form of authorship that extends beyond any single program. Maria Alvarez experiences the final stage of her arc through an ordinary act, preparing a simple meal for her family during a quiet evening, and as she watches the mundane rhythms of shared presence unfold, she reflects on how dramatically her understanding of meaning has shifted. The toast, once elevated into symbol, now exists only as a faint recollection, stripped of interpretive weight, and she realizes that this is not a loss but a liberation, freeing her to encounter moments as they are rather than as carriers of hidden messages. When her children ask questions about belief, she answers honestly but without embellishment, emphasizing kindness, patience, and uncertainty as compatible companions, and she recognizes that the most enduring transmission of faith occurs not through spectacle but through lived example, a lesson she learned indirectly through the discomfort of unwanted attention. Julian Marks concludes a multi-year research project with a final lecture that synthesizes his work on viral mysteries, using the train sighting as one of several case studies, and he presents his findings not as conclusions but as frameworks, tools for recognizing patterns without foreclosing possibility. He speaks about the ethics of amplification, the responsibility of creators and audiences alike, and the importance of maintaining interpretive flexibility, and as he looks out at the audience, he senses a receptivity shaped by years of cultural saturation with unresolved stories. After the lecture, a student approaches him to express gratitude for permission to not know, and Julian realizes that this may be the most meaningful outcome of his work, offering relief from the pressure to adopt definitive stances in an environment that rewards certainty over accuracy. Dr. Henry Wallace, reflecting on his career, revisits the themes that have persisted across decades of inquiry, noting how the language of proof has expanded beyond laboratories into everyday discourse, and he writes a brief epilogue for a reissued edition of his book, clarifying that the pursuit of understanding is not a linear progression toward answers but a continuous negotiation with limits. In this epilogue, he references the train sighting one final time, not as evidence of anything extraordinary, but as an illustration of how easily attention transforms ambiguity into narrative, and how crucial it is to cultivate intellectual humility as a counterbalance. The Proof Is Out There continues beyond this point, its format intact but its tone subtly altered, carrying forward the accumulated lessons of its own history, and while new mysteries emerge, they are framed within a context shaped by years of audience engagement with uncertainty, suggesting that the show itself has become a participant in the cultural maturation it helped initiate. The forest and railway appear in the closing imagery of Part 12, bathed in neutral light, devoid of suggestion, and this visual simplicity reinforces the narrative's final insight, that places and events do not insist on meaning, they await it, and that meaning, once assigned, can be revised, softened, or released. Aaron, Lila, Maria, Julian, and Dr. Wallace do not converge for a final revelation. Instead, they continue separately, connected only by the subtle alignment of perspective forged through shared exposure to ambiguity, and this separation underscores the story's ultimate argument, that growth does not require convergence, only reflection. As the narrative draws to a close, the Bigfoot train sighting, Jesus a story exists fully in the past, no longer exerting narrative gravity, and what remains is a set of dispositions, patience, skepticism tempered by openness, faith disentangled from spectacle, curiosity guided by responsibility, that quietly inform how each character encounters future uncertainties. Part 12 ends without spectacle or declaration, concluding instead with an affirmation of continuity, that life proceeds not through answers but through adaptation, and that learning to live thoughtfully amid the unknown is not a problem to be solved but a skill to be practiced over time. The final note of the story rests on the understanding that proof, in the deepest sense, is not always something that can be displayed or verified, but something that reveals itself gradually through changed behavior, quieter reactions, and the capacity to let mysteries exist without demanding that they justify themselves, and in this acceptance, the narrative finds its completion, not by closing the question, but by releasing it, allowing both the story and those shaped by it to move forward. Unburdened, attentive, and at peace with the enduring presence of the unknown.